pleasure to welcome you here this evening. We want to welcome you to UW Oshkosh's new front door, as we like to call it, for community collaboration, for campus engagement, and for economic development. The Alumni Welcome and Conference Center is a hub for many critical issues, and tonight's theme on the biennial budget is a perfect example of how we hope this building will be used in the future. Just as kind of an update, it was just kind of commissioned about a month or so ago, and we have now 200 different kinds of events and programs planned here already for the next several months. The facility is the campus nucleus to align community leaders, business leaders, entrepreneurs, elected officials, government affairs professionals, and other members of the broader communities we serve with the expertise found within our faculty, staff, students, and alumni. We are proud that the meeting space available here will work in partnership with that provided in the Oshkosh Convention Center, and that there will be a collaborative marketing with a full-service downtown business hotel, the Oshkosh Best Western Premier Hotel, that also has the UW Oshkosh Foundation as a key strategic owner and business partner. From our riverfront viewpoint tonight, we can see how this building enhances our community's reputation as a destination for visitors and guests. Oshkosh has many, many things to be proud of. In tonight's program, we see how an active campus and community involvement can help ensure that we have informed participation in many important educational and public policy issues. In this spirit, we are very pleased to partner with the community group Citizens for a Strong Oshkosh in hosting this session. The efforts that CSO has made, often in partnership with other individuals and organizations, are helping us to make a much stronger Oshkosh. Information like today's session helps improve public understanding and results in a stronger shared fabric to our shared community. Tonight's program will help us all become more thoughtful in the important fiscal challenges that continue to face our state. By making the effort to attend the session, you will gain insight and perspective that will prove useful as we prepare for the next round of elections to state offices, including both legislative and executive branches of government. Bob Lang is uniquely positioned to help us better understand our state's current fiscal condition. He understands the state's history, and his vision and integrity help guide efforts to develop the state's two-year spending plan. His leadership, continuity, and stability, that's what they say when you get older, Bob, reflects the highest and best traditions of selfless service that is found in public service. Over the course of my 14 years as your chancellor, having seen and experienced the full continuum of our state's political environment, you can leave that to your imagination what that continuum has looked like, it pleases me to report that our Wisconsin's core reputation for excellent government service is exemplified by the work that is done by the legislature's Fiscal Bureau, of which Bob is its leader, and other service agencies. So thank you for coming, and Bob, thank you for coming to join us. You're going to be introduced in a moment by someone much more qualified than I. So if the Citizens for Stronger Oshkosh representatives would come and give a proper introduction to Mr. Lang, I'd appreciate that.
Just to give you some idea of what Citizens for Strong Oshkosh mission is and why we're here and why we sponsor programs like this, we strive to create an open and inclusive public setting for citizens to review and discuss current and emerging needs or opportunities for improvement in the nature, character, or quality of our public structures. These sessions, like tonight's, will use fact-based presentations, effective discussion, civil dialogue, and debate to help the public understand. We're helping the public understand the importance of public structures, the need to adequately fund those structures, to better understand the local community impact of national and state level policy choices, and the independence of governmental decisions and priorities between and among the levels of government, local, state, and federal. So my fellow CSO member, Paula Velker, is going to give you a little introduction to Bob Lang.
Bob Lang has worked for the Legislative Fiscal Bureau for nearly 43 years, the last 37 years as its director. The Fiscal Bureau is a nonpartisan service agency that provides information and support to the members of the Wisconsin legislature. With a bachelor's degree from Beloit College and a master's degree from UW-Madison, Mr. Lang's record of service includes prior work as a teacher at Muskego High School and 2 years of service in the U.S. Army during the Vietnam conflict. In addition, Mr. Lang has served as an instructor with the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Department of Educational Administration. So with that, I'd like to introduce Bob Lang.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much for inviting me to be here. I appreciate Paul and Paulette's comments, and Chancellor Wells. I was pleased to receive your invitation, and I'm delighted to be here. Oshkosh has sort of a special place in my heart. I grew up in Menasha, which was just 15 miles or so away. But when I was at Beloit College my sophomore year, I became quite ill with a bout of pneumonia, and I had to drop a couple of classes. In those days, parents insisted if your kid was going to school, you had to get out of there in 4 years. So in the summer, I came to Oshkosh and got a couple of credits in geography and economics, and without that, I would not have made it through in my 4 years at Beloit. I want to talk to you a little about the Fiscal Bureau very briefly, and then I want to get into the tables that I have handed out. The Fiscal Bureau was indicated a nonpartisan service agency of the Wisconsin legislature. We started in about 1965 with a grant from the Ford Foundation, who felt that legislatures around the country did not have enough expertise in financial matters, and so Ford gave a grant to Wisconsin. It lasted 3 years, and then the state legislature took the Bureau over, funded with state tax dollars, and its purpose is to provide fiscal and policy analysis to the legislature, its individual members, and a number of its committees. We have 30 on the staff right now. The number on the staff has really not changed for almost 30 years, primarily because of the advent of the technology and the things that we can do now that we couldn't do back when I started with the Bureau. I am appointed by the leadership of the legislature. It's the two presiding officers. It's the Speaker of the Assembly, the President of the Senate, and the minority leaders of each house. It's a committee of 10 individuals. I serve at their pleasure. They can remove me if I no longer please them. Fortunately for me, they appointed me in 1977, and they have not convened since then to determine whether or not I continue to please them, and I have failed to remind them of that responsibility. So it has been a long tenure and a career that I have thoroughly enjoyed. The purpose of the meeting and the purpose of my handouts is to talk about the state's budget, and I want to tell you a little about the size of it, where the money goes, where it comes from, and then I want to spend some time talking to you about what I believe are the issues in the next biennium that will come forward. I would invite you to ask questions at any time. There's a lot of numbers here and a lot of tables, so if you have a question at any time, please stop me, and I'd prefer to just respond to your questions as we go through the document. First of all, for those of you who are not aware of this, Wisconsin is a biennial budget state, meaning we budget for a 2-year period. Our fiscal period begins on July 1 of the odd-numbered year, and it ends on June 30 of the next odd-number year. So we are currently in the budget cycle that started on July 1 of 13, and it will end on June 30 of 15. The budget that will be introduced sometime at the end of January or early February by the governor, whoever that happens to be, will be addressing the budget period of 15-17 that will begin on July 1 of 15. There are about 40% of the states budget on a biennial basis like we do. The rest of them budget on an annual basis. So our budget contains a 2-year period. What I have on this brief chronology of the budget of 13-15 is just sort of the timetable of when things occur. And this timetable will be quite similar to the one that I believe will happen for 15-17. So in a couple of months, the Department of Administration, which which works in the executive branch under Governor Walker, will submit instructions to state agencies from the university on down to all state agencies, of which there are about 50 or 55, on how the budgets are to be prepared. They're required to be submitted to the governor and legislature in September 15th, so that would be September 15 this year, 14 coming up. Somewhere towards the end of January, early February next year, the governor will make his budget presentation to the two houses of the legislature. I and the staff that I work with, we staff one committee called the Joint Committee on Finance. The Joint Committee on Finance is 16 members. It's 8 representatives to the Assembly and 8 senators. They are responsible for reviewing all bills that affect revenues or expenditures before they can be voted on the floor. It's an exceptionally powerful committee. It's a committee that vests all of the responsibility of finance, again, in that one committee of those 16 individuals. Most states operate under the congressional model of dealing with taxes and spending. That is, there's a Ways and Means Committee in the House of Representatives that deals with taxation. There's an Appropriation Committee in the House. In the Senate, there's a Senate Taxation Committee which deals with taxes, and a Senate Appropriation Committee. So there are really four committees that are involved in the process of finance. Most state legislatures operate in the same manner. In Wisconsin, all of that is vested in the Joint Committee on Finance. One of our primary responsibilities is to staff that committee. They will receive the budget immediately after it's been recommended for introduction by the governor. The committee will hold some briefings. We typically will brief the committee, and they'll have certain agencies will brief them on the governor's submission. And then the legislature the committee will hold public hearings around the state. Typically, the committee will go north, south, east, west, and I've just identified on this document where the committee held public hearings last year. We were in Greendale, Green Bay, Wisconsin, Dells, and Baldwin. And effectively what the committee will do, will go into a high school auditorium or a UW campus and just invite testimony from anyone who wants to comment on the governor's budget recommendations. In about mid-April, the committee will start to vote agency by agency and item by item, and they will conclude that process sometime in early June. And hopefully the idea behind the whole budget process is to have it completed prior to the beginning of the fiscal year, which is July 1. So I think the goal will be that the budget will be completed sometime on July 1. But at least this gives you some sense of the timetable. On the first table, which is on page 2, I want to talk briefly about the size of the state's budget. And again, this is 13-15, so I have 13-14 and then 14-15, the total amount and the percent from each source. State gets money from 5 places. The first one is what we call the general fund or general purpose revenue, which is primarily income and sales tax dollars. Individual income, corporate income, sales tax dollars, and then some other taxes, excise taxes, beer, wine, liquor, cigarettes, insurance company taxes, and others. And I will go over our taxes with you in a few minutes. So about 44% of our total amount is from general purpose revenues. The federal government kicks in about 28% of our budget. These are monies where the federal government turns money over to the state to conduct federal state programs. The best example I can give is the medical assistance program, which is a health care program for basically low-income individuals, some elderly, blind, and disabled. It's by far the largest. Almost half of our federal money goes into this broad category of the medical assistance program. Program revenue is basically user fees, where an individual pays a fee for a particular service. My best example is tuition. So tuition dollars that are paid on this campus and all of the other campuses in the university system are called program revenues. The philosophy behind funding the university system is that an individual who attends the campus benefits from it and therefore ought to pay for part of his or her education, but the state as a whole benefits by the fact that the institutions are here, and therefore our tax dollars ought to provide monies for it also. Segregated monies are those that are basically held in trust for specific purposes. The transportation fund is one, where your motor fuel taxes, driver's license, registrations go into the Department of Transportation, held in trust specifically for highway or traffic-related programs. Another example is the Department of Natural Resources runs a large segregated fund for conservation, hunting and fishing licenses, fish habitat, hunting habitat, et cetera. So in total, it comes out of fees and taxes. This budget is just short of about 69 billion. And then the state borrows money. We borrow money for two purposes. Basically, we borrow money for concrete. The one purpose is vertical buildings. The other one is horizontal roads. The Constitution specifies precisely what we can borrow money for. Borrowing money is simply the same effect as taking out a mortgage. So the university building at some campus is authorized by the legislature and the building costs $50 million. The legislature will authorize borrowing of money for that $50 million. We issue bonds. There are folks in the market who buy our bonds, and then the state pays debt service back, principal and interest, just like all of us do on a home mortgage if we take one out. We have two types of bonding. One is general obligation bonds, which means that the state pledges the full treasury, the full faith and credit of the state is the legal term, to ensure that we will pay off the debt. So those who buy our bonds, i.e. give us that mortgage, they are guaranteed by Constitution they will receive the first draw from the Treasury to repay those bonds. We have a very low interest rate because of the fact, A1, we've never defaulted, and secondly, because the pledge of making payment is so strong. Then we have some revenue bonds where rather than pledging the entire Treasury, we pledge a stream of revenue. My best example will be for roads. We do build roads and we pledge one revenue source. And what that revenue source is vehicle registrations. So if you recall, those of you who have, and I'm sure you all have or soon will, if you haven't done it this year, you pay a $75 registration fee to get your little sticker to register your vehicle on an annual basis. If you recall, you write that out to a fee trust and send it to Milwaukee. You don't send it to the Department of Transportation. What that individual does in Milwaukee is skims off what is necessary to pay off the principal and interest on the debt that we have on building those roads, and then the residual amount goes back into the transportation fund. But in total, our total budget for this 2-year period is just under $71 billion. I'm going to move from here to talk about the general fund, which is that first category that I mentioned on table 1. This shows the condition of the state's general fund for this biennium. Right now, the legislature recently left. This reflects all legislation that was passed in this session. I can go through this in some detail with you, but let me just highlight a couple of numbers. First of all, the first number under 1315 under opening balance is $759 million, meaning that's how we ended the 12-13 fiscal year. So the state had a balance, a relatively healthy balance of $759 million. Our taxes, we estimate we will collect $14,229 million in the first year. We do have other revenues called departmental revenues, which are non-tax receipts. And I've broken this into two categories, tribal gaming revenues and other. We have compacts with the 11 tribes that operate casinos. And in each one of those compacts, there's an agreement upon what the tribes will pay to the state as a tax. The compacts all vary, but they are all based on the tribe's net win at the casinos. And it's varying percentages. So a compact with the Potawatomi, a compact with the Ho-Chunk, Bad River Tribe, all of them have an amount that they kick into the state in lieu of a tax. We appropriate under appropriations. We appropriate $15 billion. We've transferred from the general fund $60 million to the Transportation Fund. The Veterans Trust Fund in 13-14 was short of cash, and the legislature decided to bolster it by transferring $5 million from the general fund to a segregated Veterans Trust Fund. We know that we won't spend all of the money that's been appropriated, so we have a line called lapses. We know that some will come back, but we wind up the year with a gross balance of $724 million. If you look at the second year, the gross balance at the end of the second year is $165 million. I think what's important to just look at here are really two numbers. The first one is the opening balance in 13-14, the $759 million that I mentioned. And the closing gross balance in 14-15 is $165 million. What that really means is the difference between 759 and 165 is $594 million. So in essence, what's happening, the budget in large part is being balanced not because revenues and expenditures are equal, but because we had the benefit of carrying over a fairly large surplus into 13-14 from 12-13. So if one talks about the structure of the budget, I think the analysis is to look at the alignment between revenues and expenditures. And in this case, much of the 759 has been used. 594 million of it has been used to help balance the budget. Okay? The next page. At the very top, I've indicated what the Constitution requires of the legislature to balance the state's budget. And basically it says that we have to have a balanced budget, and if any particular year the budget is not balanced, then it's incumbent upon the legislature to ensure that it is balanced either by raising taxes or cutting spending. And we have had some years when we finished a year and the budget has been out of balance. And the large part, the simple explanation of that is because our revenue sources are so volatile. We're relying on individual income taxes, corporate income taxes, and sales taxes, none of which are known with any degree of certainty. There's much difference between the federal government, what the state government is doing. The federal government, as you know, hasn't had a balanced budget for a number of years, but they have the ability to borrow, in essence, for operating purposes, and they do so. At the state, we're prohibited from doing that, as are, I think, all other states. So there are times when we hit a real downturn in the economy and the revenues fall off of projections. It's possible to get an imbalance. And the Constitution says then we have to bring it, the legislature has to bring it back into balance. So on the left side, other than the fiscal years, the sort of middle column here shows the kinds of balances that the state has had. Let me read these numbers for you. So at the very bottom on 12-13, the 0.76, these are in billions, so that means 760 million, which is the number that I pointed to earlier, 759 or so. You can see that we had an imbalance in 02-03, so the legislature had to come in and make sure that it was balanced. So looking at it from the constitutional standpoint, and the Attorney General, La Follette, when he was the Attorney General some years ago, opined that as long as we had a balance in the general fund on a cash basis, that we met the constitutional test. The other test of looking at a budget is on a GAAP basis, generally accepted accounting principles. We started to do budgeting or accounting on a GAAP basis back in the late 80s. States and municipalities are required to present an accounting system based on generally accepted accounting principles, which are uniform. The bond houses who rate our bonds compare us to all other states, and the way they can make the comparison is to have a uniform system of accounting. In this case, we have had for a number of years, and it's growing, and then it dropped off a little bit the last couple of years. We have a huge deficit in our budget on a GAAP system of accounting. And what GAAP does, it looks at what your obligations are that you have made into the future. It doesn't look at a 12-month period or a 24-month period, but it looks at obligations that the legislature and the governor have committed to. I will give you a couple of reasons why we have such a large gap deficit. One is, over a number of years, we've had modifications and reductions in the state's individual income tax. And for a number of those years, we never changed the withholding tables. So people were being withheld in their income tax the same amount that they were held prior to the tax cut. So even though there was a major cut, we were withholding at the same level. And what that meant was then we had large refunds that would occur once people filed their taxes. So we basically over-withheld and then paid large refunds. So in the 12 tax year, I don't have actual numbers for 13 yet, but in the 12 tax year, we kicked out the legislature, the state did. We've got about $7 billion of individual income tax collections. Our refunds equaled about $1.8 billion. Now, we had people write checks to us, so there were some folks who had a tax liability, and the checks came in at about $900 million. But even so, we had $900 million more going out than we had coming in large part due to not changing the withholding tables. If anybody wants me to go into that more, that fairly clear anyway? The other thing that's occurred, and some of you that are local officials would probably know this, the state's fiscal year is July to June. Local government's fiscal year is January to December. School districts are July to June. Tech college districts are July to June. But towns, villages, cities, counties run January to December. So back in the 80s, and we continued it into the 90s, when the state had some shortage of cash to make certain payments, they changed the payment dates that were being made. Let me give you a better example. The state paid, we call shared revenues, which are monies that go back to towns, villages, cities, counties. Okay, we were paying those in large part in June of the state's fiscal year. We kicked them out into July and November into the state's next fiscal year, but the municipalities received them in their same time period, which is a January to December date. But the state was able on a one-time basis to kick payments out so it wasn't credited to that fiscal year. Well, we've done that over time to a number of them. We have a thing called a school property tax, school levy credit. It's on your tax bills. We used to pay it in March, now we pay it in July or sometime. We've got a first dollar credit. That's on your property tax bill also. We used to pay it in March. We kick it out. So effectively, we have committed or accrued liabilities into the future that have to be met at some point in time, and they're met outside of the fiscal year. Those two things have created this fairly large gap deficit for us. So there's always a debate about whether the state's budget is balanced or not, and we can say yes it is because on a cash basis it is, but there are folks who will say on a gap method of accrual accounting we do not. So the only reason I brought it up is that just to try to at least have you understand the two accounting methods and why some folks say we are in quite a significant deficit. And we are a state which has a large gap deficit, both on a total dollar amount and on a per capita basis. Table 4 shows our general fund taxes. So I've got from years 06-07 through estimates for 14-15 of how much we will collect in taxes that go into the state's general fund. I think the key year to look at here is 08-09. This is when we really experienced the effects of the recession. And let me just take the individual income tax, top line. These are in millions, by the way, so if I look at 07-08 individual income tax, we're collecting $6,713,000,000. That's the amount we actually collected in that year. When the recession hit, we dropped down to $6,222,000,000. It was a significant reduction in collection in the individual income tax. We didn't get back to 07, 08 levels until 10, 11. Sales and use tax. In 07, 08, the state collected $4,268,000,000. In 08, 09, we collected $4,084,000,000, 180 some million less than we collected in the previous year. The state has had a sales tax since 1963. Started at 3%, jumped to 4, jumped to 5. 08, 09 was the first year ever in the state's history of a sales tax that we collected fewer dollars in one year than we did in the previous year. When you think about the sales tax, it's basically, it's kind of a tax on inflation. If you bought a pair of shoes for $100 last year and this year they're $110, we're reaping the 5% tax on that extra $10. So as price goes up, inflation goes up, sales tax generally will reflect that. Now there's a lot of other factors that go in, but the tax typically has some upside to it in each year. And if you look, it took us from 07, well, it took us till 11, 12 until we got back to where we were in 07, 08. Corporate tax is extremely volatile. Corporations pay on profit. It's a very complex tax. They pay on profit attributable to their profit in the state of Wisconsin versus what their profit is throughout the country or throughout the globe. Excise taxes, I'll just highlight cigarettes for a second. Cigarettes, we got a big jump in 07, 08, primarily because the tax was raised on January 1 of 08 from 77 cents a pack to $1.77. Then in September of 09, it was increased 75 cents a pack up to $2.52 a pack. So you see that bump going up under the 08, 09 year. Then there's some leveling off. There's a definite correlation between price and consumption. We also noticed when the state put the statewide smoking ban in, there's a drop in consumption. Other states that had that same phenomenon happen, we talked to New Jersey and New York and others where there's a definite drop in statewide smoking ban. And then in 13, 14, we think it's going up a little bit. And we think the primary reason for it is that in July of 13, Minnesota raised their tax per pack from $1.60 up to $3.43. So we have our tax is $2.52. So the Minnesota tax on cigarettes is 91 cents higher than Wisconsin's, and we do believe there's evidence of folks who will go between states to buy smokes at the cheapest price. And so we are getting the benefit of the Minnesota legislature raising the cigarette tax in Minnesota. If you want to know, just take the 575. If you have any interest in knowing how many packs that is, it's a little bit over 228 million packs of cigarettes are sold per year in the state for us to generate that kind of money. The other one that again, it's not a very big number, but it's kind of interesting, is the beer tax. We're always right around 9.6 million, 9.9 million. See, it's really declined. We're down to 8.9. Back in, I think it was the 70s, we had a legislator from Chippewa Falls named Terry Wilkham. He was looking out for Leinenkugel's interest at that time. That was before Miller Coors got in and bought Leinenkugel's, and so he was able to get something in the budget that modified the beer tax for certain small breweries. Our beer tax, by the way, is $2 a barrel. Barrel's 31 gallons. So we charge Anheuser-Busch, Miller, all the big guys, and small ones the same amount. But what he was able to get in was that if you brewed fewer than 300,000 barrels, on the first 50,000 barrels, your tax was $1 rather than $2. So it was a way to help Leinenkugel. But you guys have them up here too, the tremendous number of craft breweries that are developed, and a lot of these folks are making a lot fewer than 300,000. Most of them are barrels. And so we're seeing this decline is occurring. We think because just the shift to so many people, they're not drinking less, they're just drinking a different kind of beer that we're not taxing as high as we are in the other ones. So our total tax collections, you can see on the bottom, in that 08-09 year, the state took a real hit, lost $929 million from the previous year. And then in 9-10, pretty much flat, almost no growth. And then we've had some growth, and in 13-14, we've had tax cuts which have dampened the amount of money that would have come in without those reductions. So the 1% in 13-14, relatively small increase. I said that I would talk about some issues as I go through this, and the first issue that I would like to talk about, what I believe will occur, again, it depends on the political climate after the elections, but the governors indicated, the current governors indicated, and I think there are members of the Assembly, and in particular majority party, who have indicated that they would seek another reduction in the income tax. I have no idea what the magnitude would be, but I think there's an effort to continue to try to reduce reliance on the individual income tax. So I believe that there will be some pressure on the general fund of some magnitude, I have no idea what it would be, to further have reductions in the individual income tax, which will obviously reduce the amount of revenues coming into the state's general fund. On table 5, I'm going to talk about where the money goes. I'm looking at, these are 2-year numbers. I'm taking the state's general fund, roughly $15 billion a year, and I'm looking at the distribution of that $31 billion in the general fund for these 2 years. We categorize expenditures into 3 purpose categories. The first is local assistance. Second is state operations. The third is aids to individuals and organizations. Local assistance are monies that go from the state treasury to local units of government, towns, villages, cities, counties, school districts, tech college districts. The state had the first individual income tax in this country, imposed it in 1911. And at that time, the legislature prohibited local governments from having an individual income tax. And the deal that was struck with municipalities and counties then was that the state would share part of the revenues it collected from that tax back to local governmental units. Hence, we have a program called the Shared Revenue Program, which has been in existence ever since. Historically, more than half of the state's general fund budget goes back to local units of government. So half of the income, sales, corporate taxes that are collected go back in some form to those local school districts and municipalities and counties. State operations is what it costs to run the state. The 2 large parts here are the university system and correctional operations. We have a part of the correctional budget that actually goes to local assistance. We provide some monies to counties for youth aids programs and other things that they run. So I know the Chancellor Wells would say it looks like the UW system's getting almost a couple $100 million more than corrections. If you do corrections in total, the correction number is about $2,319 million. So these two sort of run neck and neck every year, and right now corrections is getting a few more dollars than the university system in total. The last category, aids to individuals, is where the state has a direct relationship with a taxpayer. The medical assistance program I mentioned earlier. It's a program whereby the federal government provides 60 cents for every dollar of health care, and the state puts in 40 cents. So if a person is on the medical assistance program, Badger Care, Senior Care, etc., the feds give 60% of every dollar spent for a provider. So someone goes to a doctor's office, doctor bills them $100, feds cover 60% of the bill, or $60, the state kicks in 40, okay? So we have a direct relationship with a citizen. We have a thing called the Homestead Tax Credit Program, where at a certain income level and certain property tax level, the state relieves the burden of the property tax on those individuals, depending on where their income is. State writes a direct check, of a direct relationship. So those are sort of three categories of spending. On table 6, I just laid out under each category where the dollars are going. Let me help you read the table. So under the local assistance category, elementary and secondary school aides received $10,228,000,000 in 13-15. That represents 65% of the local assistance category, and it represents 32.9% of the state's budget. So 32.9% of the state's budget, this is our largest appropriation of funds, goes to elementary and secondary school districts. The UW system under state operations is 27% of the category, 7.2% of the state's budget. AIDS to individuals and organizations, medical assistance, $4.6 billion, 63, almost 64% of the category, and just shy of 15% of the state's total budget. So I have listed here about 29 or 30 programs that account for almost 95% of the state's budget. And I've got a small other category here. So the big dollars, you can sort of get a sense where they are. If you want me to talk about any of the programs or explain them, I can, but I think that the chart at least gives you some sense of where the cash is in the state's general fund budget. I'm making a comparison in Table 7 over a 4-year period. And the reason I picked these years is because in 9/11 we were in the depths of this recession. So in 9/11, at the top, and please stop me if this doesn't follow, our total in 9/11 in the three categories was $27,193,000,000. Okay? If I looked at the breakdown of the percentages, 56% of the state's budget in 9/11 was going to local units of government. 26% state operations, 17.8% aids to individuals. Now if we compare that to 13-15, you can see the shift that's occurred. So in this last budget, local assistance, 50% is going to local assistance. State operations about the same on a percentage basis. Aids to individuals shifted upwards to 23%. So in the middle table, the growth over this period, 9/11 versus 13-15, the increase in the first category, local assistance, $486 million, 3.2%. State operations grew at 14%, aids to individuals 49%. The average is 14%. So you can see the tremendous amount of growth just in the category of aids to individuals. And then the last of the tables here is I'm trying to look at and say, what sort of shift is there? Or stated another way, if we distributed the $31 billion in this biennium based on the percentages that the categories had in 9/11, what's the shift? And the shift is shown below. Effectively, local assistance went down $1.7 billion, aids to individuals went up $1.7 billion. State operations, insignificant change. The reasons for this were a couple-fold. Number one, to assist states in getting through the recession, the feds enacted the federal stimulus funds in the 9/11 budget. We collected almost $5.2 billion in federal monies, some of which was to help the state balance its budget. One of the things that the feds did that meant a lot of money to the state was rather than providing 60%, 60 cents on a dollar for medical assistance, it jumped it up to 70%. It varied by quarter, but we got up as high as a little over 70% sharing. So they're giving us 70-30 rather than 60-40. A significant amount of money because the program is so large. The second thing is in a recession, typically what we find is that incomes go down, more individuals are eligible for certain entitlement programs. Our medical assistance caseload went up significantly. We currently have about 20% of our population is on the medical assistance program. It's about 1.1 million. Our population is about 5.7 million. Another thing that occurred was that limits on what local governments could levy for on the property tax and what school districts could levy for on the property tax, those limits were made more stringent. They were driven down. And the property tax didn't go up significantly because even though there wasn't a lot of state money going into it, the amount of money that local governments could raise was limited by state law. And so that also had some shift between these categories. Another thing was the whole Act 10 provisions that went in that basically said that local government, state government had to, employees had to kick in a certain percentage of their retirement contributions and increase the amount of money that kicked in for their health contributions. So there were folks who favored that policy who were able to say or would say that that provided some resource to local governments that they had not had to provide by putting it into health care or retirement benefits for their employees. So all of these things and potentially some others really caused that flip to occur between these particular categories. On table 8, all I've done here is taken the top 10 items from table 6. So the top 10 account for 81% of the state's budget. And then down below, and I think this again sort of reflects the shifting that's occurred. I looked at how much money each of these programs received in the 9/11 budget compared to the 13-15 budget. So elementary and secondary school aids actually went down over that period by $64 million. Medical assistance went up by $2,285 million. And you can sort of see where the others are. The one sort of anomaly here is the technical college system, which in 9/11 got $273 million from the state. 13-15 it went up to $617, and that's because in 14-15 the legislature appropriated, when it had surplus of funds, appropriated $406 million more to the technical college system. The whole idea behind it was, I think, a first step towards really looking at taking the technical college system off of the property tax. This $400 million represents about 2/3 of the operational levy for tech colleges. There's a study committee that the legislature is going to embark on fairly soon that will look at, I think, among other things, taking them off of the property tax roll entirely. That there are some real issues with that, primarily the governance of the system, because unlike the Board of Regents that governs all of the campuses, the technical college districts are governed by their own individual local boards. And so there are significant expenditure differences between the tech college districts also that I would assume would need to be addressed. But the big reason for this huge shift in the tech college districts of 125% is because this infusion in the fiscal year coming up of $400 million. So the other comparison, again, we're looking at total increase here over the two biennium of 14.4%, and you can see sort of who the folks that gained and the folks that sort of gave at the office here with regard to the shifts. So the question is, what's the impact of the state on the Medicaid if we would have accepted Medicaid expansion? So effectively, under the Affordable Care Act, if a state were to provide eligibility for medical assistance for individuals, adults, up to 133% of poverty, the federal government would effectively provide 100% cash for that. What we have in Wisconsin is the state was providing medical assistance to parents 200% of poverty and below. The current system before we made a change in the budget. We were providing some dollars for childless adults, but a diminishing number because the state stopped enrollment in the program. So I think we've got it somewhere around 15,000 or so childless adults who are still on the medical assistance program. So we had basically parents 200% or below were eligible. Childless adults really sort of capped because we capped the program. So the feds said if you expand medical assistance up to 133%, we will cover 100% of it. What the state did, the state dropped the 200% parents down to 100% and let all childless adults up to 100% be eligible. So effectively, anyone at 100% of poverty or below is eligible either for the state's medical assistance program, others will go on to a federal exchange or whatever. So there was the fiscal amount of it, and I'd have to try to remember these, but I think if we would have taken the federal money, it could have been in the neighborhood of 120 or so million that we would not have spent in this biennium of general fund money because we would have received 100%. So the huge debate, and it's happened all over the country, is whether or not to accept the expansion. And the expansion dollars over about 8 years go from 100% down to about 92%. I forget the exact drop off, but it's like it stops at 90 or 92, which is still significantly higher than the 60 that we're getting right now. So a number of people, I think those who supported that policy would say we have a number of people, somewhere around 80 or 90,000 who are not receiving medical assistance, childless adults primarily, who are now receiving it that they weren't before. But on the other hand, we've got almost a comparable number of individuals who were receiving it who no longer do. We're either going to go on an exchange or some other thing. But it was a relatively significant amount of money. And it is if you carry it out forward over a number of years. But it was a large debate. It was a huge debate in the legislature. A philosophical debate. Okay?
Yeah, so it wasn't revenue neutral, right? I mean,
No, it wasn't revenue neutral. It was not revenue neutral. No. I mean, in terms of individuals, and again, these are kind of round numbers, 85 or 90 in each direction, 1,000 people, but it was not revenue neutral. Yes.
Could you just briefly define what shared revenues is? I can grasp what the other categories are, but not.
Okay. It's monies that go to towns, villages, cities, and counties from the state. Okay? We now call it the municipal aid formula, the county aid program, but everybody calls it shared revenues. For a number of years, the shared revenue formula was based upon population and an ability to pay, if you will. That is comparing your property values to others' property values, so the lower on a per capita basis. So there's an inverse relationship between per capita values and the amount of money you receive. So a poor community received more than a wealthy community on a value of property. There was a utility component also, but the two that I mentioned were the big ones. And it was based on what your expenditures were also. There was sort of this three-pronged formula. I think maybe 8 years ago, I'm just going to guess, it's between 7 and 10. Let's just say it was 8 years ago. The formula was basically frozen. So what you got last year is what you're going to get next year. So the components of the formula have not been operational. So if, I have no idea individual communities here, but let's just say the city of Oshkosh gets $5 million in shared revenue payment, okay? It would get the same $5 million over a number of years, but the legislature has at times made reductions in the total pot. So if I'd go back 6 years or 8 years or so, I would assume the city of Oshkosh is getting fewer dollars today than it got back 6 or 8 years ago when the formula was frozen. Okay, okay. And the same would apply to, I think, counties and most towns, villages, and cities. So it's a declining source. But that's what it was. And again, it goes way back to 1911 when the state pledged, we will share revenues with you. And it's not restricted revenue. It goes to help municipalities operate their governmental programs and to relieve some of the burden of the property tax.
The notion of fund balances, surpluses, reserves, what's fiscally prudent, how important are they? Because this isn't just a Wisconsin thing, as I think you know. A lot of this is being discussed throughout the country, and I think it's going to continue to be discussed beyond the particular institution it's been discussed about now.
Right.
Could you just help us clarify what those are? What's a dispassionate way to talk about them and try to understand them from the perspective of the state as a whole?
Yeah. Let me go back, and some of you will remember this. I'll go back to the 78 gubernatorial election. Dreyfus ran against Marty Schreiber. The state had a surplus. We went into that election with a couple $100 million surplus. Dreyfus ran on giving that money back to taxpayers. We had a fairly significant cut in the income tax, and he stopped withholding. I don't know if you remember, he used the term, let's withhold withholding. So we went for 16 weeks where nobody paid withholding taxes in, and then we sort of adjusted your liabilities at the end of the year. And this is my own opinion. I think, and then I would say after the last year or two of Dreyfus's terms, we had a recession, and then Tony Earl inherited that recession, and it was a tough time getting out of it. Taxes were raised to do so. I think that the legislature and governors have looked at the balance as anything too high means you've overtaxed, but you don't want to go negative. We never had in the state, up until a couple of years ago, a rainy day fund. Most states, our neighbors in Minnesota, had a healthy billion-plus rainy day fund. So when the recession hit, they were able to draw on those sources. I mean, the concept behind it is in good times you stash some money so that in bad times you can draw from it. And we all know we had recession in 80, 81, 82. We had one in 01. We went through this one, recently. But we were never in a position, the state, I don't believe, that we ever accumulated a significant rainy day fund to help. So I think fundamentally the question of balances in governments is how much is too much and how much is too thin. And so that's the basic issue. We are viewed somewhat unfavorably by bond rating agencies because we do not have significant balances in the state's general fund. The folks that buy our bonds, they just want to make sure they're going to get paid. They want to get paid their principal and interest, their coupon payment. We now have built up where we've got about $280 million in a rainy day fund. We call it the Budget Stabilization Fund. It's less than 2%. I mean, 1% in our budget per year, $15 billion is $150 million. So we're running a 1.8% or so stabilization fund. I think a number of states have looked at getting target 3%, 5% of your operating budget should be set aside. okay? 5% in our case, 750 million would be a pretty good amount. Alaska, by the way, can run their government for 2 years, 2.5 years on their rainy day fund. They got all that oil money coming in, they just accumulate so much of it. And then Sarah Palin, I think helped her a lot. She wrote checks to everybody, man, woman, and child who lived in Alaska. You want to just get some free money and go to Alaska, and you get a check every year. You just have to be an inhabitant. You just guts it out for 6 months, you get a pretty nice check. But even with that, they just have, the oil money is just rolling in. And there are other states, North Dakota's in the same position right now because of what the oil that's going in. But setting all that aside. And the issue that the chancellor is talking about is, I think, is particular with regard to the university. And what's occurred with the university is that it has balances that some people felt were significantly high. And in particular, they were in the balances, I should say, that had accumulated over a number of years in tuition. And I mean, right now, I think at the end of June of 13, I think the tuition balances are about 551 million or so. So it's and the tuition that comes in at the university annually is about $1.2 billion or $1.3 billion. So 550 million is a fairly significant percentage. You're up in the 45 to 50% to 40%, somewhere in that range. And one of the things that the legislature wanted some reporting and some other requirements that they've imposed on the university. And tomorrow, as a matter of fact, the committee that I work for, the Finance Committee, is going to vote on sort of what those limits should be. The university and others would look at it as saying, hey, our enrollments are volatile. We have certain things that we've planned for that we ought to have. We need certain balances to be there. So the debate is how large and what are the things that are planned for. But certainly, it's prudent to have some kind of balances. Local governments have them. School districts have them, in large part because their revenue comes in at various times of the year. So if you're a school district or a municipality or a county, you're getting property tax collections sometime in January, let's say, and some will send them in earlier than that. Then you have to settle up in July or sometime, whenever the settlement is. But the base source of your revenue is coming in at, for simplicity's sake, let's just say 2 big times during the year, okay? It kind of varies. But, so at times, at any time you look at somebody's cash balance, you've got to have a balance to get you through the period when you don't have revenues coming in. So I think it's prudent to have it. I think it's at what level. I think that the issue in particular with the legislature is how high should those balances be on the tuition side in particular. There are other funds that the university gets that are restricted. So if I give a gift of $1 million to some campus to build a building, it ought to be used for that particular project. But I think the primary concern is on fees and tuition, and how much should tuition, where should tuition be? The legislature imposed a freeze on non-resident tuition for these 2 years. The regents imposed it on all tuition. So it'd be not only for the legislature put it on resident tuition, resident undergraduate, okay? The regents put it on all tuition, resident, non-resident, professional schools, docs, lawyers, etc. The governor came out, as you know, a couple weeks ago, I guess it was, said that he wants tuition to be frozen for another 2 years. I don't know if he meant all or just resident. I don't know. I don't think we know that yet, okay? I think the thing to be cautious of is not to just blow out all of it, but to have some sustained plan on how to use those balances and determine what a prudent balance is. But I think the legislature felt the balances were too high there. Somewhat similar to what they thought back from drape us on what the balance ought to be in the state's general fund. But we are not a state, at least from the state's budget, that have embraced large balances going forward. I don't know if that helps.
There's just a couple of other things I don't want to get into, long detailed things. The purpose of this is for us to understand. So is it not correct, or is it correct that by statute, for example, the UW system cannot carry forward any of the GPR funding? The fact that GPR funding would cover costs of continuing one thing or the other.
Right. That's correct. That's correct.
So there's more tuition dollars in every budget, fund balance or not, there's more tuition
Right.
paid to expense. So is it true or not that the amount of tuition dollars and fund balance is both somewhat inflated if we have to spend the GPR, which all this money comes together?
The general fund money, that's income and sales tax dollars, the university has what we call an annual appropriation. Effectively, you get 12 months to use it or lose it. In other words, if you don't spend it, you lose it, okay? And if you spend over, you have to get authorization from the legislature to go over. So in the university, and I'll state this fairly simply, but the university runs its instructional budget by general fund dollars and tuition dollars. So they pool these dollars together for instructional purposes. And they spend the GPR dollars first because they know if they don't spend them first, they're not going to, they're going back to the treasury. And so what they carry forward would be tuition. I think one of the things, Chancellor, and you know this as well as anyone, that was a concern was the growth in the balances over a number of years. And effectively, resident undergraduate tuition, the regents were increasing about 5.5% per year. But in that time of 6 or 5 or so years, the balances were increasing at a very significant rate. And I think in June of 12, I think the balances were like 450 or so million. June of 13, they're like 551. So it's continued to move. I think what the legislature is looking at, and I believe that the president of the university, the new president of the university, and I believe chancellors in the regents and others are looking at, we need to indicate why the balances are where they are and what our planned programs or commitments that we need to make and justify why we need balances of that level, which I personally think is a good exercise for the university and for the legislature. I don't believe, I never know how the legislature will react, but I don't believe they're interested in saying, you can't spend this $10 on this, or I don't see where they're going to get down to the level. They will rely on the regents and what the campuses do, but want to see some program or some plan on how we're addressing it.
Mr. Myers, when I look at your materials, and I look at the June 30th general fund balances, it shows June of 2011, 85 million, June of 2013, 760 million, and then projected June of 2015, 163 million. So it shows an improvement, but we're back very close to where we were 4 years ago. But on TV, I hear these commercials that talk about a swing from negative 3.4 to a positive 1 billion. And what's the right set of numbers to use for an apples-to-apples comparison of where we were 4 years ago and where we are today?
Yeah, I think the probably best apples to apples would be to just take that column that I have on that table and look at what the balances were at the end of each, what you did at the end of the fiscal year, okay? And the number, the $3+ billion number, is when Governor Walker came into office, we had a number of liabilities that were potentially there, okay? We owed the state of Minnesota money. We had a reciprocity program on income tax. They dropped out. We owed them money. The state had borrowed money from the Injured Patients Compensation Fund. That's sort of the doctor's malpractice fund. State took $230 million out of that to help balance the budget. Supreme Court said you can't do that. It's a taking of a private taking. And then we looked at what going into that first budget of Governor Walker's, what agencies had requested, at what funding level they wanted to be at. When you added those all up, I like to say we had a challenge of the 3.4 or 3.6 billion. We did not have a deficit of 3.6. We simply said, as a beginning point, if we were to fund all of these commitments, some of which were legal that were thrust upon the state, and funded all of the requests that agencies would have made, then we would have had to come up with that large 3-point-something billion. But the state balanced the budget. I mean, the legislature it's required to balance the budget. And so it balanced the budget. And it did so by cuts or the Act 10 stuff and whatever else occurred. So I think it's confusing to the public, I grant that, to know what the apples and the apples are. I think if you want to use the 3.4, the 3.6, then you have to go back and compute that number for, prior biennia or biennia that occurred after that. But there's no doubt about it that it was a considerable difficult position for the state to be in.
So if you tried to compute a similar cost to continue number, presuming that the request would be of a similar size, what would that amount to for 2017?
It'd be a lot less. I think it'd be a lot less. I do think what the legislature has done is it has addressed, and again, when the federal stimulus money dropped, I mean, that really helped us get through 9/11. I mean, I'm not sure what we would have done without the federal stimulus dollars. That helped the state get through 9/11, and I think like most other states in the country, the hope was this thing ends and the revenues start to kick back in. And that hasn't occurred at the level that people hoped for, and the federal government was in a position where they could not continue at that particular level of stimulus dollars into the states. But I think the budget is in a better position now than it, and even the 165, I mean, we've passed some budgets that don't have anywhere near that when the budget's passed. I mean, it's razor thin. So I think it's definitely been an improvement. Yes.
Apply this question to your tenure in the legislature. There was a time when the primary tensions were rural Republicans and rural Democrats against urban Republicans and urban Democrats. And that was the most significant tension. It seems now that Republicans tend to represent suburban and rural areas, and Democrats tend to represent city-urban areas. And the needs to those different parts of the state tend to be somewhat different. You mentioned earlier on that you were looking at, or there was a prospect of a tax cut or people were interested in tax cuts. Have the tensions become more ideological now than they were earlier in your tenure, or are they still primarily a function of geography?
I think the pockets of Republican voters, the strong pockets of Republican voters, Waukesha County, other places, has not changed significantly. And Representative Hintz can certainly respond to this as well, or certainly better than I can. I think the pockets of Democratic voters has remained relatively unchanged. Iron County, Douglas County, Milwaukee County, City of Milwaukee, et cetera. Okay, now, there's movement from time to time based on, movement of population, demographics, et cetera. But in essence, Dane County is going to vote Democrat. Everybody knows that. City of Milwaukee is going to vote Republican. Everybody knows that, okay? Iron County is going to vote Democrat. Everybody knows that. Douglas County, et cetera. Waukesha County is going Republican, and other pockets. I believe that the fight for the majority party of the legislature always is in the rural areas. It's always who controls the rural areas of the state. Rural sort of mean the western part, like the Eau Claires and some of those that flip back and forth, west of Madison, Iowa, Sauk, some of those places, where the party that controlled it always won those rural sort of seats. And I think that Wisconsin historically was a urban-rural state. The battles were between the urbans and the rural. I mean, you look at some of the programs we have. Transportation aids. Those towns just said, we want our expenses might not be as much, but we need a bigger piece of the pie. We need a bigger piece of the pie in shared revenue. That's sort of classical battles in terms of funding and who got the funding. And so I think you had more rural Democrats and Republicans joining together, maybe more so then than now. Same way on the urban side on those issues. So I think there's been some shift. But I believe but I still believe that the battleground for the majority is in the rural areas of this state. Yes.
Back on the university budget, I take it the numbers we're talking about are on a cash basis?
They're a cash basis.
Has anybody run an analysis on the university budget on a GAAP basis?
I think that is what the expectation might be on the part of the legislature from the regents, because I don't believe there's a good enough understanding of what those balances are to be used for. I think they have simply built up. That was the question. How did we go from 200 million up to this? Right. But what we don't know, which I think the chancellors and the regents are going through now, is what you're just asking for. Okay, we're sitting there with 551 million in tuition right now. If we were to look at what our planned purposes are for that and the timing of when they will be expended or continue to be built up, I think that's the question that hopefully we'll find out in the course of the next year or so.
Just quickly jump in, I think that's a great point. When this first broke, WI Oshkosh put out exactly what its plans were for its fund balances as part of, we knew what all they were, where they're going, what they were planned for. When the audit, the state did the audit, they determined, and they came up with these great categories, which I think are very helpful. Planned, obliged, so on and so forth. There's still details that will work out there. But WI Oshkosh, the audit bureau, determined that 99.4% of its fund balances, this was on the 2012 balance, that's what the whole issue came on, were documented for particular purposes and functions and so on. But you're absolutely right. There isn't a GAAP accounting approach to that can make that clear.
Right, right.
And that's the issue, because
Right.
those of us who run these places have this sense that we would look at a GAAP accounting thing. We're not in that great a shape. We've been trying to figure out how to get all of us, through
Right.
the Great Recession and keep access to our public institutions. So I think that's a really, really good point.
I think the other concern with it, on the part of the legislature and probably the governor, was that of that large fund balance in tuition at 450, or whatever that number was, at the end of 12 when the reports came out, about 127 of it was sitting in system administration. They don't teach one kid. And I think people were saying, how do we build up a balance of that much money held in the system administration account? And so then questions came, how is it distributed? How is it expended? What are the purposes for? So hopefully we'll know answers, and I think the president and the chancellors are on the right track, and the regents are to do that. Let me go to table 10 for a second. I apologize for putting so many numbers on a page. My purpose was not to confuse, okay, but this is another issue that I want to bring forward. The key number, well, let's just start at the top. This is the property tax on a median valued home in Wisconsin. If you go to 9293, far left, up on the top where it says value, in 9293, the value, median valued home in the state was $71,789. You take all the homes and you add them up and you hit the one in the middle. That's what the value was. So we adjust this every year based on changes in value, economic conditions, etc. That home in 14-15, we estimate will be worth $151,000. It's the same home, okay? So we're taking the same home and moving it out and looking at what are the property taxes on this home. Without going into the whole thing, I just want to get you down to a line called the net tax bill. Do you see that? It's about 60% of the way down, okay? One of the things that the legislature pays particular attention to is ensuring or trying to that the property tax on a median valued home does not grow by more than 1%. And it's this exercise that they use. So just look at 0708. Property tax on a median valued home was $2,836. In 14-15, we estimate it'll be $2,822. Amazing, over that period of time, okay? The governor, I think in the middle of March, said that if elected, re-elected, he for 4 years wants to ensure that that 2822 does not go up. To ensure that that happens, one must either dial down the amounts that local governments can raise from the property tax, or there needs to be an infusion of state dollars to offset the property tax. Those are sort of the two options, or some combination of the two, okay? In any event, and I wouldn't think it would be just on dialing down what locals can raise. It'll require some infusion of state dollars to do that, which puts another draw on the state's general fund. Income tax cut one, holding a property tax down, is another. I think sort of second issue. The third with it, and a way to do it, is to just take some things off of the tax roll entirely. So let's say the tech colleges are no longer on the property tax bill. That drops the property tax bill, but the tech colleges need cash. So that would require some infusion, probably of general fund dollars, into the tech colleges. So that's sort of my second and third issue. I don't know. Now, I want to only highlight. I want to highlight one other thing, and if you just go to page 16, table 14. I think a major issue in the next budget will be the transportation fund. And the reason for it is this. The primary source of revenue for the transportation fund is the motor fuel tax. We pay 30.9 cents per gallon state tax. So whenever you buy a gallon, 30.9 cents goes to the state. Up until through April of 06, every year the state indexed the motor fuel tax based on increase in inflation, consumer price index. So every April, the motor fuel tax went up from maybe 30, let's say 26 cents to 26.9 to 20, just would go up. It was like 9/10 of a cent. Indexing was suspended. The last time we did it was April of 06. And what's happened is our revenues are basically flat because cars are more fuel efficient. And when you're not increasing your tax to go with the reduction in consumption, you have flat or lost revenue. And if you just look at this table, I've got 8 years prior to 06, 07, which is last indexing, and 8 years after 06, 07. So it's just 8 years in each direction. So if you look at the motor fuel tax in 98, 99, 64% of the transportation fund, 797 million, came from the motor fuel tax. 14, 15, that's going to drop to 56%. But if you look at how much we take in motor fuel taxes in these years, there's virtually no growth. If our estimates are any good, we might be slightly higher in 14, 15 than we were in 06, 07. But the price of road construction is just, it's not only gone up, but we've got huge projects, especially in the southeast part of the state. The zoo interchange down by Milwaukee, a couple of freeways of ours. I mean, I've driven, 41, you guys have driven it more than I have, but that's a major, major project that we undertook. Vehicle registrations, the percentage is bigger only because we increased, and I've got footnotes, we increased vehicle registration a couple times, and the other category is not much. But if you look at the right side, we are not seeing large increases in revenues. So what the legislature has effectively done over the last number of years is we've borrowed more money to build roads. We are borrowing money. We're not raising revenues, not really reducing expenditures. Tremendous demand out there. We're borrowing money. So if you look over on the very last table, we are now at the point where almost 18, 19% of our transportation fund dollars are doing nothing but paying off principal and interest. And if you look at these last 4 years, on the left, after the years, the left column, amount of transportation revenues, and then I've got the increase or decrease each year, and especially look at the last 4 years. Our transportation revenue has grown 28%, 28 million, declined 23.6 million, gone up 44.7, 26.3. The next column is our debt service. Our debt service is exceeding what we're bringing in revenue growth each year under our current system. So everything we're taking in, we're eating up plus more just to pay off our debt. And so at some point, we will have to have a discussion of how we fix the transportation fund budget. One way is to increase revenues, i.e. taxes. And I'm not certain that there'll be an increase in revenues on motor fuel tax, don't know, or registration. The thing about raising the motor fuel tax is we export quite a bit of it because we catch traffic between Chicago and Minneapolis. When we increase registration fees, we tax our own. Okay? There's talks of maybe tolls, but there's some real prohibitions on that and other things. My point would be that I think there will be another pressure on the general fund to help the transportation fund. The governor in the last 2 budgets has recommended that mass transit be funded from the general fund rather than from the transportation fund. That's about $110 million a year. Legislature rejected it, but they did move about $100 million to help the transportation fund out. There's also talks about should we have part of sales tax go over to the transportation fund, i.e. some percentage on vehicle sales or vehicle parts or whatever that are somewhat related to transportation. That just drains the general fund more because all of that goes into the general fund now. My point would be that I think the transportation fund budget will dominate much of the discussion of the next budget because the state simply cannot continue to pay an increasing percentage of its revenues just to pay off principal and interest.